In a world with artificial intelligence, how do we transform education? Thanks for tuning in. I'm Daniel Lopez, and this is the AI Education Conversation, where we explore the opportunities, risks, and impacts of AI across education. If you'd like to join the conversation, check out the AIeducationconversation.com. Let's jump in. Hey everyone, I hope the week is treating you well. Artificial intelligence. It presents really amazing potential for language development and translation as early as the next couple of years. We've already seen so many companies as they're building their large language models come out and talk about how many of the things that excite us with artificial intelligence chatbot tools like ChatGPT and Claude and their ability to do things such as summarization, creation, create personalized examples. It can not only do this in English, but it is able to do so with relatively comparable performance across 20 plus languages. So now let's take this and imagine a scenario where, as an example, a Vietnamese speaking student enters a full immersion English speaking classroom on day one of their schooling experience with an AI translation device, and that device can seamlessly translate both languages so that a student can engage in content without having to develop a full language competency right off the bat. As you can imagine, many companies are really excited by this possibility and are working fervently to make this a reality. A world where technology makes communication across languages seamless and accessible. While AI technology presents the capability to make this translation a reality, I'm wondering if it comes with trade offs. We know that every language, let alone dialects of languages, also include cultural context, nuance, and semantics, meaning the gap for miscommunication still exists. In a world where this technology is adopted across the world, does it also lead to a loss of cultural competency as folks rely on AI translation rather than learning new languages and the cultural lens which comes with it? At the same time, many schools and teachers across the world are experiencing tremendous challenges in supporting multilingual learners. As our communities continue to change, there are classrooms where many different languages can and may be spoken. And if you're a teacher, how the heck do you support students with all of these different language contexts? Can AI help you do this? Tan has some insight here. As a multilingual education expert who speaks six languages and an individual who's taught close to 2 decades in a variety of educational contexts, Tan is uniquely positioned to provide important answers to these big questions. If you are interested in my takeaways, sign up for the conversation at the AIeducationconversation.com. I share all show notes with my community 12 hours before sharing on my social media networks. If you want to continue supporting the podcast, would really appreciate that review, that rating, share it on social media, share a recommendation to a colleague. All of these things are free to you and go a long way in helping to amplify this space so that we can host bigger conversations. If you have any other thoughts on today's episode, you can join the conversation at theaieducation.com. Feel free to also message me on LinkedIn. I'm very active on LinkedIn. Finally, if your school district or organization is ready to explore AI and you're ready to make a change going into next school year, I still have some limited availability for workshops and consulting at the AIeducationconversation.com. Humans at the heart of education. Enjoy my conversation with Tom today.
Ton Win, welcome to the AI Education Conversation.
What's up? It's good to be here.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here. Just in the pre-show here, I know I was talking to you a little bit about my enthusiasm and connecting with you just because I don't know much about what it takes to support multilingual students through their educational experience, but I stumbled onto your website. I've been reading a lot about your resources and man, you're killing it. I feel like there's so much I've learned just in the past week here as I've been reading your blog posts and listening to some of your podcast episodes about what it actually takes to support our young people who may be, aspiring to learn multiple languages or aspiring to learn English, from another language.
Well, you're now my mom has a fellow listener as herself. So I'm honored.
No, I that's funny. Well, let's just start there. I mean, I know we were talking a little bit about your background and it was just interesting to learn more about, where you're coming from, your set of experiences, but just so that we're all on the same page here. I think a lot of the resources I saw, it seems like your mission and your focus is primarily around supporting what you're calling multilingual learners. Just kind of curious to know a little bit more how you would describe your passion and your mission, and where did this come from? Where did this passion to support multilingual students come from?
I think all good things happen by accident. So I wasn't supposed to be a teacher of multilinguals. I was trained with Teach for America to work with in English. My goal to be a teacher was to get students to pass the 10th grade Louisiana State reading assessment. That was my only goal. Then I showed up and then I was ready to teach Romeo and Juliet and I was ready to teach novels and poetry. And then the students like showed up were like, some of them were Vietnamese. Some of them spoke Haitian Creole. Some of them spoke like Cajun Creole. And then some of them, a lot of them spoke Spanish. After Hurricane Katrina, we had we're indebted to the Spanish speaking community coming together to build the city again. So a lot of Latino construction workers, we were like, wow, I've never experienced this before. I thought they were supposed to be ready to speak English, and yet some of them could not speak English at all. That was my first interaction with multilingual learners. Even though I am one, I grew up one, speaking Vietnamese at home, then going to school and like cussing out my friends in English, and then coming home being cussed out in Vietnamese by my mom. It's like, so multilingualism is like part of my life, but I didn't expect that as a teacher. I was never prepared. Like many of our colleagues listening today, they're not prepared because they didn't go into education to teach multilingual learners. They're either counselors or content specialists, such as science teachers or geography teachers, or they're working in elementary school and they're not expected in the coursework to work with multilinguals. I was caught off surprise. I could do everything I could to learn. The best way to learn is to go abroad to where multilingualism is so alive in international schools. I worked abroad and then I got lucky enough to be at the position to teach students who are learning English. I didn't know there was an actual dedicated position. Now I realize that before at our schools, we had ESL teachers. And so I was like, oh, you could be one, not just teach English lit. Became one, fell in love with the students who were the top of their class before they came to our international school, and then they dropped down to the bottom. And that's what really like tugged at my heart because I could see them wanting to say more, be more, express more, but they were so limited by their English that we were trying to figure out how to help them. And that's where the passion comes from now.
I think it's so interesting too how you talked about how multilingualism, you never really saw it as like a major part of like your professional endeavors, but then as you jumped in and started becoming an English teacher, it really quickly became elevated to something you realized that was not just a skill set that and something that was essential a part of like your personal life, but became actually essential in the way that you were navigating and supporting the various needs of your students. I think what makes that so interesting for me at this given point in time, and I don't have any like anecdotal data to support this, but I what I will say is that as somebody who spent a long time teaching and just working in schools in Houston Independent School District, and then now being in Massachusetts, what I have observed is it does feel like there are communities throughout the United States and potentially throughout the world where the demographics of those community, the cultural fabric of those communities, and the languages spoken are changing. I know that when I was in Houston, we had, of course, a large volume of Spanish speakers that were within the context of those schools. But over the time I was there, I realized there was a lot of students very similar to what it sounded like happened to you in New Orleans that were speaking Creole, speaking Vietnamese, speaking Arabic, or speaking some African languages that, to be honest, I just didn't even have too much context on what they were speaking, but I knew it was very distinctive from some of the other languages I've heard. And then, when I now having come to Massachusetts and been here, there's a large population in communities speaking Brazilian Portuguese throughout some of the many schools here in Boston. And I talk with some of the principals that are working there, and they talk about how some of the demographics of some of their schools are changing, where something like multilingualism wasn't really important to address in any type of way. In the last 20 years, all of a sudden now they're having to think about resources and supports in a very different way. So maybe we could just start there for a little bit and think more granularly about that from your perspective, when you think about a multilingual student who's navigating a school, and I know obviously there's varying degrees to this, and you're welcome to go as nuanced as you want, from like a newcomer to somebody maybe who is multilingual but has been in the United States or whichever country for a long time. I know that there's probably a, a different experience there. But when you just think about multilingual students who enter a school building, what are some of the daily challenges or maybe questions that they're experiencing that you don't think maybe folks are aware of?
right? The main one is the identity crisis. Students come into schools and for my international schools, many of them come from very privileged schools where they come before. So they're affluent, they've gone to best schools or really good schools statewide, like in their country, top of the class, highly proficient, outgoing. They come to class and they can't say much. What they want to say, like let's say that they want to say a full page of content, but they can only share a sentence because where their English is. It's almost like their sandbox is now like a corner of the sandbox where they used to play. They could play everywhere before. They could build and create, or their canvas, or their paint palette was so multicolored because of the language before. But now they only have like two tones. They could paint very limitedly, not vividly, right? And so they feel like they aren't who they are, and so it's an identity crisis. They question themselves: Am I actually smart? Do I actually belong here? And then we put in practices in some schools where we pull them out of their classes and say, you know what, you're not ready for social studies, so I'm going to pull you out for extra English. But yet, it's the actual English that happens in social studies class, in science classes, in art classes and PE classes that develop their English skills in context. And they pull them out, we give them extra English. Or we pull them out and then we give them English for social studies for English learners. And research has shown that pull out becomes segregated learning. And we know from the past that segregation in education is never a good mix. Right? And so oftentimes the barrier is brought down so that students are more successful, but that the rigor is brought down so that their curriculum they learn on less rigorous content. They sometimes often don't learn grade level content. Instead of a lab experiment, for example, in a science, they might be just coloring pages or doing crossword puzzles or just flipping cards. I remember when I was an ESL student in second grade in particular, I was taken out of my classes, I don't know, at random times, put into this room with this lovely teacher who I love, and my other classmates who were also English learners. And we would like play like matching card games. And so we would flip a card and we would have to say monkey. And I would flip a card and I would say like flower. Oh, and then we'd flip it back again and we didn't find it. And it was fun for me, but I didn't care. But looking back, I'm like, maybe I should have maybe that teacher should have stayed in that class with me and then taught me the content that I was teaching, but making it accessible. So because I was pulled out, I often thought I didn't belong. Or actually, I always thought I belonged, but other students, maybe they think they don't belong. They think that maybe I'm not good enough to learn the same content. Teachers that might inadvertently think maybe you don't belong in my class. You belong to someone else's case. You're on someone else's caseload. And so learning becomes outsourced to somebody else. And so that's a identity crisis. There are so many ripple effects of like when we say you should have a different education, but you don't belong in this class, like who will pull you out. There are so many ripple effects. And most of them happen in students internally where they think, oh my goodness, am I competent? Am I capable? And that's the first challenge. And then the other challenges people are familiar with. They can't speak, they can't communicate fully. They struggle to speak at academic or write, produce language at the academic level. And that's people are aware of that.
As you started to talk about that, I just kept thinking about my first year when I was an eighth grade English teacher in Texas. And in that year, about midway through the year, we had a student who was in one of the like English language learner classrooms move up to one of the full immersion, full on English classrooms as she was developing her level. And I distinctly remember how there was one day we were working on a quick write and she hadn't written too much. And, I had sought to just like talk to her more of an individual basis. And I knew that she was new. So I was trying to still speak with her in English to push her to feel comfortable engaging there. But I was trying to speak a little bit slower just so that I know she could process and catch on. And she started getting really emotional. And I could tell it was just because I think that, to your point, there was a lot she wanted to say in response to the question. I think she understood what I was saying. She understood the question, and she just couldn't like put together all of the words and articulate it in the way that she knew she could had this been in Spanish, right? And immediately when I just took a minute to say, "Hey, we're going to pause for a second. I'm just going to engage with you in Spanish now because
Mm,
I'm fortunate that I can't speak Spanish. I know that this is your language, and I think this will be helpful in this moment. I think for us to just like just decompress, and immediately she like responds to the question. She's so eloquent and articulate.
yes,
She had so many thoughts about it. And it's yeah, I mean, to your point, I can imagine just how frustrating that can be. I mean, my wife and I, a couple of years ago, went to Italy, and I had been seeking to order something off of the menu, and I don't speak Italian, and I just remember feeling the same way, a little bit frustrated, like, "Ah, I'm just trying to tell you I want this thing," and I'm, like, kinda pointed to it, and you don't understand what I'm saying, and so but that's, like, to your point, the daily experience for many of our students who are navigating a new country and environment. They're trying to do the best that they can to learn and sharpen these tools and just working through it, right? And needing that. But to your point, the solution maybe is not to pull them from that experience altogether. I think it was important that she was in the class and she was struggling and growing from that there, even though it wasn't, like she could just flip a switch. And I think the other thing that I'm curious to get your take on too is I've had the privilege as well of just of teaching a lot of bilingual, multilingual students. And I think one thing I've also realized is though a lot of pieces of that experience can feel challenging, there's a lot of superpowers I think that come with it. And
yes.
one of the ones that distinctly came to mind was in the last conversation I had with my guest Alfonso Mendoza, who's now is like a very successful podcaster and works in schools there. And then even with some of the students I've talked, he talked a lot about how growing up as like kind of the broker of English in his household, he was like put into a lot of environments well before like his age where he was having to translate, say, like for his mom or his dad, like going into a hospital and like having to translate that experience in like in a very adult way. And I just kept thinking, like, man, there's so much leadership involved with that. Like being able to say be like 11, 12 years old and you're like having to show up in almost like an adult type
Right,
fashion and translate this like
right.
very high stakes, complex conversation between like your family and this like professional institution. And so I'm wondering like what else maybe comes up for you around like just like some of the superpowers that being multilingual also creates.
Right. Being multilingual, you really you the language that you speak is the lens in which you see the world. Right? And so because I speak multiple languages, all of them poorly, I have six different lenses to see the world. Because you see things, because you're able to compare, oh, this is how this is said, or this is why this is said in English, or this is why it's said in Spanish. For example, like in English, we don't speak about the third person. We don't say like Ton feels like this, or in Spanish, or like in Spanish we go mijo, mija, right? Even though they're not your children, right? That's like a familiar thing. But in Lao, in Thai, in Cambodian, Vietnamese, people call you. They don't say the word you. It's considered rude unless you're like family members. But they call you child. They call you like I would call you older brother, or people call me. They would call you uncle, and I would call my kids like my nieces and nephews. Like everybody is a community, and so the language that we speak helps us like influences how we live. And so because a person is multilingual, they have a different understanding of the world. But when they become multilingual, they have multiple understandings of the world. And because they have multiple understandings, they can see, oh, this is where you're coming from. This is your perspective. Oh, that's my perspective. I see where the overlap is. I see where the divide is. I see where the friction is, and I see where the opportunities to bridge are. And so that's why multilingualism is so important. Uh, We often say people get hired for their technical skills, but they get fired for their soft skills or the lack of. And so when you have a person who's multilingual, they are quite relationship based, or they because they understand, okay, they know, let, let me move throughout interaction through um, cultural perspectives. Where are you coming from this? Where are you coming from that? Because of that, they're able to understand and solve problems. They're able to um, further relationships, make connections. And that's why they're so valuable. Lastly, they're really critical thinkers because they're linguistic problem solvers. They're saying, oh, I would say La Casa Negra or La Casa Roja, but in English, we say the red house. And because of that, um, they're comparing, and that comparison that's constantly happening linguistically develops cognitively. And so there are many, many benefits besides like having a job where or a business where you can work with multiple people. It the empathy part is the most important, like the relationship building and the ability to see others in a different way and to step back and say, oh, I'm only looking through my perspective. Multilinguals have that ability to step back and say, ah, it's not just me.
Yeah, the third person piece you described is such a, I think, a good example, just because I think oftentimes, and to even take what you said further, like is some if anybody were to really speak about themselves in the third person in English, it not only is like foreign, it also comes across as like highly arrogant,
Yes.
right? It's like if somebody's ever like, well, Daniel's going to go to the movies, or Daniel thinks this about himself, right? It would come across as if I'm speaking arrogantly about myself. But I think to your point, having an understanding that in different languages, that's not the context that you have, it just allows you to become a more proficient student of the world, and just like be open to different ways that different norms show up in different places through language, right? Is kind of the bridge. So that resonates. Thanks for, I think, walking us through it. So when you over the course of your career and the tremendous amount of learning that you've done on your blog and your podcast, what practices or strategies have you learned are highly successful in supporting multilingual learners? I think you mentioned one already, which is like the self-immersion aspect,
Right.
but I'm wondering
Right.
beyond that if there's anything else that
Right.
you've learned here.
Well, beyond that, I think there are two lenses in which I see the world. Hey, this is going to be a crash course in master's education and in students of those who are learning to be teachers of another language. So if I could put everything together in two things, it would be one, comprehensible input. If things are not understandable, the instructions, if the students don't understand what you're saying, understand what they're reading, understand what they're listening to, there's no output, right? And so what we have to do is make sure that the articles we share with the students, the things that we're asking students to read, our communication, the way we talk to students, um, the way we instruct at the board beside them is um, comprehensible. If there's no comprehension, there's no output. So for today, my students were learning one eighth grade class. I was working in the class, social studies class, and they were learning about creating a constitution. If they don't know what the word constitution is, they cannot create the articles. When they looked at the word articles, they were like, a newspaper? Like, no, no, no. An article means different rules within that constitution. So they understand that, they're able to do that. Let's move to a science class, grade 9 today. They were looking at something called Semke diagram, where it's like talking about input, like energy input, energy output, and energy wasted. So they had to like draw different parts of the diagram. If they didn't know what the word wasted means, or the word useful, or the word input means, there's no way they can draw that or create that in their diagram. And so when I was working with my students, like one of the biggest words was scale. So student Googled the word scale, and she's like, on a fish? And I was like, no, 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 no. Here, scale means like the same size. So we have to make we have to figure out the scale for our diagram. So each block going to represent 5 units, 10, 15, 20? And then she got that. And then so we broke down the word for scale so that she could create a scale diagram for her assembly diagram. Those are just two examples of, if there's no input, there is no output. And so when we work with multilinguals, we have to figure out, are they understanding what I'm saying? Can I make this more comprehensible? Can I provide an example? Can I explain this one word? Can I ask them, what part of that in the instruction are you not understanding? And then work at that level, at the word level first, and then help them communicate or understand.
To your point, context
Mhm.
matters, right? And I know that that tends to come up a lot too in the college access world where I really work, where oftentimes we just kind of assume that we can take an English facing slide deck and Google Translate or something and it's going to land. And it's like you take a concept like financial aid and you're like going into a group of Spanish students or Spanish families, and you're like, oh, necesitas aplicar for ayuda financiera. And what you don't realize is whether you call it financial aid or ayuda financiera, they still don't know what the hell you're
No,
talking
right.
about, right? Because they've never done it before. You have to explain in non-academic terms what that actually means. And because this is the first time they're going through it, regardless of what language you're talking about it. And I think for some students, it sounds like that's the case as well, where it's like they're beyond the fact that so many words can have five different meanings. They also may have never had the experience talking about what an articles is or looking at a constitution before. And so there's just some pre-work that you have to do there to get them to understand in relatable concepts before you get to even the task, which resonates. So, well, if that's the case, if having comprehensible inputs is something that is critical to just the experience into that language development, I'd love to maybe bridge this now and start to talk about artificial intelligence. I know that you have started to think about this quite a bit in both in your podcast and grappling with guests on this, but as well as in some of the writing that you've done. Just wondering with maybe first before we get into like how it can help, when you first heard about artificial intelligence, what was your reaction to it? Like how did you first hear about it and what came up for you as you learned about generative AI
The
specifically?
first time I heard about AI was with my science teacher last year. I was working with her and she wanted students to write an article about a topic. I forgot what it was, but she's like, oh yeah, I asked I don't know what she used. Maybe she used ChatGPT. She said, I asked ChatGPT to produce this ninth grade level essay. And then she said, I looked at it and it was like, there are things I liked, there are things I didn't, but it just gave me now an outline of what to have students write about. And I was like, wait, you didn't, because when she initially said writing sample, she said, oh, this is the sample that I'm thinking about having students to write on. Let's create an outline. I'm like, where did you make that? Did you write this? Did you have time to do this? She's like, oh, no, I had AI do it. And I was like, what? She's like, yeah. I was like, what is AI? She's like, I don't know. It's like a thing. It's like Google Plus better or Google like so much better. It's like having like X Iron Man having his person that he talks to in his office or on his like glasses that he speaks to, and then the person
Hmm.
speaks to him back, and it's like, oh, that's what it's like. So, and it's like, that's cool. Okay, that's cool. That's not for me. Then, like a few weeks later, she came back and like we did another thing where she's looking at scenarios. She wanted students to go through the different scenarios, and we're like, oh, these scenarios are cool. Where did you get them? Oh, I asked AI to do it. And I'm like, okay, so now you've said two things that are really cool. Let me go try this out. And I did it because it was the summertime. Came back and I have David Panford, a fabulous teacher who's guiding the light for our approach to AI. So if you want him on the podcast, I can connect you to him. He shared with us, he's like how he's using AI, how we're already using AI through YouTube, through Spotify, through Google, like Google Classroom, Google Translate, Grammarly, things we're already using. We just don't know it. Now let's make AI something that we can change the instruction for us. Initially, when we're talking about AI, we're like, oh my goodness, we're scared that students are just going to produce copy and paste work. But he's like that's just one thing we can worry about, but that's later. But like, let me cut down hours of planning for you with AI. And I was like, okay, show me how to do that. And so he taught the whole secondary, and that was in August, and I've been using it since. And I would go to Google and Google and Google. I have basically not gone to Google in months, maybe since the beginning of the year. Because now everything that is asked through Perplexity, everything is asked through Poe. Before there were lots of like platforms, but now I just use Perplexity for research, Poe for making things more comprehensible. So let me give you an example. Eighth grade science, so eighth grade social studies. Today they were again doing the Constitution. One of the questions was Article 1, what type of government will you have? Democracy or dictatorship? And if it's democracy, what type? A republic or a constitutional monarch? And I was like, monarchy. And I was like, how do I explain this? Okay, Poe. And I wanted to teach my students, because they always keep coming to me like, what is this word? What is that? I'm like, I'm not your walking dictionary. I want you to be independent. Use Poe. And they said, go ask Poe to do what? And so now they know that like they have to go take a word and they say, please explain constitutional monarchy at grade three in one paragraph, right? Because and it produces for them. They know to do that. So they read it and I'm like, I don't understand. I'm like, what's the next step? And said, let me put this in Khmer. And then students asked Poe to put it in Khmer. So now they have a they have a tool, but now they have a strategy to use that tool to make it comprehensible for them. And so that's how I use it. I might even, when I am, so let me move to my own class. When I'm teaching, now I'm teaching a free verse novel called Inside Out and Back Again. It's about a Vietnamese refugee and her family. And as I was reading it, I'm thinking like, okay, Poe, please give me 8 to 10 of the most essential tier 2 vocabulary words that are important throughout this entire book. That's based upon the theme. And it produced like 20 words for me. And I was like, let me pick 8 that I want the most. So we picked scarcity, deteriorating conditions. Conditions as one of them. And so these are the words like I never would have thought about scarcity. It was fabulous. And then I said, okay, of these 8 words, can you put some of these words into a final essay prompt? It gave me a few prompts and I decided to use this one. I said, to what extent does deteriorating circumstances influence our actions? As a refugee running from a war, the characters had to go in a boat and the phase of their life, their conditions were deteriorating. Right? And so their actions really changed because of the deteriorating conditions. So that's a wonderful way that Poe helped me create this prompt. I didn't take it exactly from Poe, but I thought, oh, that's an interesting approach. Let me take this and edit it my way. And then because I'm teaching vocabulary, I'm having students learn each of the words of those 8 words, like scarcity or deteriorating conditions. And I said, Poe, can you please give me a series of questions like this related to deteriorating conditions? It has to be this or that comparison question. So it said, what would impact an athlete's performance more, the deteriorating conditions of the field or the deteriorating conditions of their sporting equipment? So thoughtful, but like really active. But students now, because I asked them, I'm like, Poe, I have a class of kids who love K-pop, who are sports athletes, who are athletes and who love video games. Create different scenarios based upon that. This or that would be more. Right? And so it saved me I still have to make my slide deck. I still have to rate the question, but now it's like my co-teacher. So I get to, my time is reduced because the ideas are given, and then I edit them out. So I rarely copy and paste what Poe gives me. All I simply do is it gives me ideas and then I edit it to what my liking is. So I'm a master editor of AI. I don't just copy and paste. And so it has really changed my work with multilinguals because now they have a tool when I'm not there to learn. But it has also changed my own practice because it saves a lot of time.
I really hear you saying that it's been especially helpful in thinking about how to contextualize examples for students that they'll be very interested in based on what you know about them. And then also in just that scaffolding, right? As we know, there's so many, there's a need for you to do so much in developing materials or like scaffolding particular text for students. And that can take a lot of time. And it sounds like that has reduced the amount of time that you've had to do that significantly. I'm wondering from your students' perspective, if either in maybe some of the data that you've seen for like a quiz you've administered or something like that, or maybe just anecdotal things that they've told you, do you think that they're experiencing your class differently, or do you think it's pretty much the same experience, but it's just vastly different for you in terms of your time
I
spent?
think what I notice is now before when there wasn't AI, students and I would like, let's say, I remember last year we were looking at in science, we had to look at synthetic chemical materials. So things made from synthetic chemicals, molecules, part of science. And then we had to talk about the impact, both socially, environmentally, ethically, whatever, economically. And we would have to read all these articles And students would have to like sit with me and like they kind of like we would scan through an article and like I would be scanning for them and they're like sitting and kind of scanning with me too. But they're not at the same like, reading level. So they're kind of basically waiting for me to figure out if this is the right article. Or like most of the time I find myself like reading an article and then all of a sudden like, this is not helpful. Let's find another article. And then I look at the clock and there's 10 minutes left. I'm like, oh my goodness, no. So now because I switched to Poe or Perplexity, I ask it a very concise question. Students ask it a very concise question, and a very concise response is given back. Because of that, there's no more like need to waste time to figure out if is this the right resource that gives me the information. And so that their experience is that they're able to do the work more efficiently than read a few articles and then spend that 3 days reading the articles and realizing none of these really help me, right? And so it has been drastically different in their perspective as it is a tool to help them learn more efficiently, to learn the content more efficiently. So it goes back to comprehensible input. They can understand the content more easily.
That's bringing up, I think, maybe a bigger question I'd love to grapple with you on, which is, so now that we have this technology that is clearly over time going to lead to a significant amount of hours for you that you'll have back in terms of things that would have taken you maybe 5 hours are now taking you 2 hours. And it sounds like over time you can expect there to be at least maybe we don't know exactly how much of an increase, but definitely an increase of engagement of students in your class. When you think about the the like most optimistic vision of like multilingual learning or experience that you would hope to drive to, what do you think that that looks like, and how do you think maybe like AI can help you like reach that, whatever that means for you?
I know you asked that question that I saw in the preview document, and I was like, I don't know. Initially, I had a few answers, and then I put like three question marks. I'm like, I don't actually know the future because you asked, do you think we'll ever need to have multiple for people to know multiple languages if AI can do all of these things, right? Is that the question you're asking now?
Yeah. No, I think I'm
Oh,
asking a
okay.
different question, but maybe it's helpful to wrestle with these in tandem. Which is, so I think at least to table set this a little bit based on my understanding, and then maybe you can push back or offer a different perspective here. But I think my understanding, at least for how English language support here in the United States looks like, is I think oftentimes when we think about multilingual learners and how to support them, I think the end game goal is really just about making sure that they learn
Exactly.
English, right?
Yeah.
That's the goal, right? It's not really about doing anything more than that. I don't think it's about making sure that they feel seen or that they're retaining their cultural heritage or any of these other elements that I think I've heard you and some of your guests talk about on your podcast. It's truly, I think, about making sure, do they understand English? Like, how quickly can we make sure that they're proficient in this language, the language of all of the schools here in the United States, or the majority, right? So I think knowing that we are now in a position where I think some of our most talented multilingual teachers, or even teachers who maybe are not multilingual or monolingual, but then have a lot of multilingual students, now have a set of tools that they can use to actually support those students with that goal. What I think I'm wondering is, does this that all inform how we think of like the goalposts here? Or is it only now just about English retention still? Are there other goals that we should hold or consider as we think about the educational experience we want our young people to have? And I think if it's helpful to grapple with that other question as you're thinking about this, definitely I think let's get into that too. But also I think it's okay if we talk about that just in second question, because I do think that that is another interesting layer to this, which is there's so many companies that have set aspirations right now to develop that like holy grail type of device, right? Where either it's an earpiece or glasses or, a voice recorder or whatever it is that essentially seamlessly allows you to communicate with somebody in a different language, and you can speak in your native tongue and they speak in their native tongue, and you can have like a pretty seamless conversation without having that. I think it is helpful to think about the role and the value of speaking multiple languages in that context as well. And I don't know that I have a clear answer, and I'm wondering like what
Right.
your perspective is on any of those super easy questions to answer that I just threw your way. So
I'll attempt to end the first one. So maybe the vision is, or reframing the first question with AI, is it not, is the need to only have them develop English, is that the only goal, right? It's like, can we do it? Does AI help us redefine a goal? And so yes, it does, because then it says um, English is not now the only end goal for multilingual learners, but full access to grade level curriculum is the current goal and should always be the goal as well in the future, where students now are not pulled out of classes. Students now are not given the opportunities to have the same access, to have the same teachers, to experience the same learning activities, experiences. It's equity. So we're talking about the goal is to not just have them learn English. Goal is to make sure they have the same opportunities as everyone else. Just because they learn another language, just because they're learning English and the English isn't as proficient as others, does not mean they have a segregated experience. And AI helps them stay in that class to not have a segregated experience. They can stay in the class to learn about Samke's diagram for energy input. They can stay in the class to co-create that constitution of that utopian society with their classmates, with the teachers, not just the associated teachers, but me, the ELD teacher, to support them. The goal, I think, would be, summarizing it, it would be inclusion, so that they can contribute to the community. And I think you also said another thing where, is it also about sustaining cultural heritage? Yes. If they're going to be included, they should be allowed and encouraged to bring their cultural assets to contribute to that class in different ways, right? So they might, for example, that constitution class, they're not just learning about constitution and how to create a constitution or about human rights, but they're looking and analyzing their own countries and saying, you know what, your country doesn't have this in the constitution, but my country does. Or, oh, like, I wonder why your constitution really cares about the right to bear arms. Well, my constitution doesn't do that. And so we have a conversation about that, or students are able to bring their experiences to that to contribute. So it's not just English. They're allowed and supported and encouraged to be in content classes, so they get the same level of curriculum. But then it's also, as they're in their classes and learning the same level of content, they're able to contribute from their experiences and their assets. And we're all the better for it.
yeah. No, to that last point, I mean, something that's just occurring to me in this moment now, based on what you said, is that I know a big, I think, challenge that we've had over the last 10 years or so is just like as a society, at least here in the United States, potentially a world problem though, but at least here in the United States, we've really in technological spaces have I like identified the camps, if you will, that we most
Yes.
align with around like politics or culture. And we've dug in, right? And we're like, this is the camp, this is what we think, this is what we feel. And it occurs to me that if you are able to successfully have students from a lot of different cultures in a classroom and you're doing the best that you can to like keep that classroom intact and like not pulling students based off of English or things like that, that there may be opportunities over the year for everybody to learn more about where everybody's coming from, right? From like a cultural standpoint or from just like a perspective and how you're thinking about you're all reading the same book, but maybe we all think about it very differently based on the cultural upbringings that we've had or our family dynamic or whatever it is. And I think from my perspective, I think we're all stronger because of it, right? I think to your earlier point, the more that you are a student of the world and you have a deep context on how a lot of different people think, not just like your small community, I think it just helps you to have like a better understanding of how to navigate this like really complicated world. And hopefully what that allows us to do is we can still disagree on things. We can still have conversations and still have it, but at least now we have a more informed conversation with a more grounded perspective and like where each other's actually coming from versus just like saying yes or no and that's it, right? And like we just dig in and just we believe that our way is the only way and the world looks like, and when we know that that's not true, right? Everybody has a different lens that they're bringing based on their unique experiences, their culture, their family, their religion, all of those pieces that may come up there. So I I'd love to spend a little bit of time grappling with this other question because I don't know that I have a a definitive answer here, but I think it's something that it's important that we start to wrestle with, because I think right now clearly there's a lot of companies that are have a vested interest in making this a reality. I think that it potentially creates some advantages in terms of how seamless it can be for us to communicate with each other. Let's say you are some American businessman and you now want to go to do business with leaders in Hong Kong or in China or Japan or something, and you don't speak the language. Now there's a way to do that more seamlessly through technology or something and have like a really productive, meaningful conversation, create areas of collaboration without having to study Cantonese or study Mandarin or study something like that. But I also, I guess, am trying to think like, what am I not thinking about as it relates to unintended consequences of driving towards a language or technology that creates an information communication
Right.
exchange, which is not
Right.
grounded in any one type of nuanced language. And I'm wondering how you're wrestling
Right.
with this
So I
question.
think the technology will exist where we can speak multiple languages and understand each other, but we can hear one language where we can like, I'll be speaking to you in Lao, and then you'll be hearing that in Spanish and understanding it. Right. And like, so it's like live UN, or like when we go to the United Nations, people are like having things translated for them. It'll just be live, right? Um, that'll happen, but I think it cannot replace the deep nuanced understanding of a culture without learning that language, right? And so how do we say this? I'm trying to figure out an example, and I again that gives me the example of in Lao, in Thai, in Vietnamese, and in Cambodian, Khmer, we often say the word we instead of I. So if you're working with a Cambodian person or a Lao or Thai Vietnamese person, and you start to realize that they're really invested in the community, that's because they often speak, and when they say we, when they say I in a sentence, we're really worried about this, and there's no one in the room besides them who's speaking. They're really saying we, I, as the community I'm representing here. And so just because you can, just because you can hear what a person is saying doesn't mean you're listening to them, right? And so when we know a language, we not only hear words, if we know that language, we can listen to what they value, and that's why we learn languages. Yes, it'll make things easier to communicate, but it cannot replace the deep understanding that comes, the deep appreciation of a person, of a culture, of a way of thinking without that language.
Yeah, I think as you were saying that, the example that came up for me is I think oftentimes, I'm Mexican American, and I think oftentimes, like in my community, some of the expressions we'll have is we'll say things like "tenga ganas" or like "ponte las pilas," right? And translated into English, right? "Ponte las pilas" means like put your batteries in, and so that doesn't make any sense, right? What does that mean? But then when you like understanding that in Spanish, it really means like you got to dig deep right now. Like you have to like do the best that you can. And it's like a very motivating expression, even though it doesn't sound like it in English. And it really just means like, hey, you got to dig deep right now. You got to do whatever it takes to like achieve the mission or to, overcome this like obstacle that you have. But obviously again in English, it's just put your batteries in. It's like, what? So I think you're right that there's a little bit of that can be lost with this like broader global assimilation that right that may happen with having technological devices. And to your point, some things may also just get lost in translation when you have like universal devices that are trying to translate into multiple languages. Clearly it's not going to do so with always with the nuanced intention and the intensity behind maybe some of the like or the gravity, if you will, behind some of the like expressions or phrases that are actually being said in one language and then being translated into another. Though I do think, I mean, some of that is still probably very helpful for all of us. I mean, it would be really nice. Like I'm thinking back of, to times when I was in Houston and like I had to, put one of my student into circumstances, which I hate doing, but it's like I don't really have an alternative where, I had a student who was speaking Vietnamese, and she then had to sit there and translate between what I was saying and what her parents were doing. And it's things that I had to do that, and that was the alternative. But in having a device in that moment, even if it was only 75% effective, could have actually been really useful just for the both of us in navigating that and not having to put the child in the middle as the
Awkward, yeah.
intermediary there, which happens
Yeah.
so much. I think what I'm also wondering is, to in the spirit of so I know I told you this before the pre-show that I was gonna do it, so this is your time to shine here. Oftentimes, a ritual that I saw you doing in some of your episodes was really asking your guests a question and then asking them essentially green light or red light, right? Green light meaning what should we continue doing? Red light, what should we stop doing? And so what I'm wondering from your perspective is as you think about supporting our young people in schools with learning new languages and potentially leveraging technology as a part of this as well. What's your green light and what's your
So the
red
red
light?
light would be stop assigning tasks and start to explicitly teach the language requirements around that task. If you're teaching a lab report or book report, a biography, you can't just say, go and do this and come back in 3 weeks. It has to be explicit instruction of what that task requires. What does that biography means? What are the different parts of the lab report? You have to teach the academic language required of that task. So the green light would be in conjunction to that red light. So if red light is to stop reciting and start teaching explicitly, the green light would use AI to figure out, okay, I have students do a biography. I want students to do biography. Let's figure out how can I explicitly teach that. I can ask AI to please produce an outline of a report for 1,000 word report on a biography. What are the different sections? Then I can check that outline to say, oh, you know what? Students are not going to not know this part. I'm going to have to actually teach this. Right? Or I can ask, so, okay, so I want my students to write an evaluation, but I'm not sure how I want to write an evaluation for science. So, hi, Poe, can you please write me an evaluation about a method, about this experiment that's different than my student's experiment? I now have a model text to analyze. So then I can start teaching my students explicitly, right? That's why, that's how we can mirror them together. Red light, don't just assign. Green light, if we're not assigning, then let's teach explicitly through AI, with the aid of AI.
When you think about the teachers and the schools across the world that are in the process of continuing to support students with either learning English or trying to learn other languages, any other broader advice you would offer them at this moment in time, either with using AI or just with teaching those young people in general?
Oh, broader. It would be the broadest would be the comprehensive employer comprehensive output, which we already structured. But even broader would be, um, am I teaching? There is language in everything we do. And if you look at WIDA, which is, for those not familiar, it's like a gold standard of English instruction. They say like in language is at the word level, at the sentence level, at the paragraph level, and at the organization level. How can I make the word, the sentence, the paragraph, the organization's ideas comprehensible? And then how can I make how can I help students write those words in thoughtful sentences? How can I have those sentences connected together in a single paragraph? How can I have multiple paragraphs structured together to communicate a cohesive idea? And so when we hear the phrase, all teachers are teachers of language, people are like, yeah, I don't know what that means. The broader recommendation would be that's how we do it. We look at the word, sentence, paragraph, and then organization level of whatever our task is. That's how we can be a teacher of language by teaching that explicitly at those 4 levels.
Ton, if folks are interested in connecting with you and learning more about your work and all that you do, how would you invite them to connect with you, and what are some of the topics that you'd love to just
Yeah.
engage with
To
you?
my mother's pride, I'm the most famous Tan Win out there. So if you just put Tan and the word win, HUYNH, you will find lots of things about me. I'm on Twitter, or formerly Twitter, X, LinkedIn, social media. My mom would be proud if she wasn't the only subscriber to the podcast, reader of the blog.
Well, she's not the only one. I've read some of your blogs and I've listened to multiple episodes. So I would actually also add that for any of those out there listening, if you're interested in just hearing more around this conversation that Ton and I are having, I know episode 146B, Ton is interviewing one of his guests around AI and use in supporting multilingual learners. So if you're ready for just another 45 minutes on this topic, I know that he had a conversation there. So I would personally plug that episode on his podcast. And so, Tom, thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate you coming on and
Muchas
sharing your
gracias.
wisdom with us.
It was an honor to be here with you.